In this video we'll talk about texture displacement. Now when I say that, I do not mean the displacement of a mesh by a texture. I mean the displacement of a texture itself, including, amongst other things, by another texture. To give ourselves an idea of this, let's just start out with a simple procedural here, like dots, and let's hook its colour into the surface colour. The way that we go about displacing a texture in Nodal is via the vector inputs here for scale, position, rotation and fall-off. This tends to give us a similar behaviour to what we would always see in the layer editor when using texture displacement, to have one layer of texture displace another. Let's just clone our dots and we'll use this to be the displacer. First of all, let's look at the different things we can feed in. First there's the colour, which we're already seeing. Then there's the alpha, same thing but a bit brighter. That's because in this case the foreground colour is only set to 200, not 255. And then the bump, which is of course this normal data, consisting of X, Y and Z values, and therefore rendering as red, green, blue mix when plugged into a colour as we have here. This means there are three ways that we can use one node to displace another. We can either use the colour output or the alpha output, and assuming of course that we're using black and white on the colour, then using either would be basically the same. And we could use that to drive one of these values, and of course that single scalar of 0 to 1 would occupy all three vector components. So if we're to plug alpha into position, and of course the colour of this into colour, then we see this effect, as those pixels on here, which are completely white, move the pixel on here, or the spot rather, the textured spot. Where there is a white coloration on the surface from this node, then the white coloration, then the coloration beneath it, if you will, on this one, is moved in X, Y and Z by 1 meter. You notice that our centres are all still in the same place. This of course is because both nodes currently have a scale of 1. If they were both a fraction of, so let's do that now, here we go, making them both equal, we see that we get a different outcome, because of course the bright white centre pixels, if you will, of this spot are being moved not 750 millimeters but 1 meter, both in this direction and that direction, and if this were a 3D object in the Z as well. So we should be seeing white up here and over here when we plug that alpha to position, which is what we see. So what about bump? Let's plug in bump. And you see that we get something completely different. The reason, of course, is because bump has different values for X, Y and Z. Using the alpha or colour in black and white, of course, just performs a 3-axis move of the value between 0 and 1. This, of course, has independent amounts for each axis, or can at least have independent values for each axis, because it is a vector. The other thing that this does, because we're now using the bump, is we can use the bump amplitude, which scales each of those X, Y, Z vectors, essentially. And so the amount of movement owing to each vector is different, is scaled back. Let's also take a look at what happens with the scale and rotation inputs here. You might think that if we take this colour that matches this one exactly, or this pattern of black and white, and we plug it into scale, it starts to feel like the logical thing to happen is where it's white, everything scales up. And so what you should expect to see, perhaps, is these white centres growing and these dark grey edges, which are of course going to be a fractional number, 0.1, 0.2, you'd expect them to scale down, almost like a contrast. However, notice what does happen is we get this sort of psychedelic mess. Why do we get this? The reason is because you've no ability to change the point of scaling, or the centre of scaling, just because you've got this texture that looks like it's making these nice little centres for you. They're not actually passing any kind of coordinate centre data on. When we just scale this node by itself, you see it always scales from its centre, which is of course the object centre, the object origin. So when we plug the colour, or of course the alpha, then each point further away from that centre is scaled progressively a different distance on the object surface, and so you get these unusual feedback-like patterns. Very hard to predict what it's going to look like other than psychedelic. And the same, of course, is true of rotation, because rotation always happens around a common centre. Therefore, if we plug the colour or the alpha into rotate, then our central point, in this case, because we're just using the simple dots, will appear to stay the same, and you'll get this shifting, changing pattern around the outside. Sometimes this can be really quite useful when you have got a repeating pattern like dots or brick or whatever, and you're trying to create patterns in interiors for who knows what, wallpaper, carpeting, etc. This trick can be a very good way of creating those just sort of graphic, formless, repeating patterns on things without it being too repetitive and procedural looking. However, again, it is hard to try and visualize the effect in your mind before hooking things up. So in a sense, using this kind of texture displacement can seem daunting because you don't really know what you're going to get till you hook things up, and it's hard to know how changing values are going to affect things, at least in the visual sense of the picture you get out the other side of it all. Again, if we look at putting bump into the scale or position, we see that again we get these things with this different effect going on. Again, harder to visualize because you've got a three-way value vector coming in. So, graphic art style patterns that you can get some degree of predictability about behavior out are one good application for this kind of texture displacement, but by far the more common usage that a lot of you will encounter is its usage for creating natural patterns. So, let's have a go with a little crumple node here. See what we get right off the bat is this. It's nice, it's alright, it's obviously crumple, especially inverted, those of us who are used to crumple. So, let's start displacing it, and we could use another texture, of course. I am just going to use the same old crumple. Most of the time, you're going to hook up to position, because it's usually the most useful. So, that's where we're going to start. And of course, what we get is just lots of very small noise. So, we'll start with our amplitude lowering. Now, already we're getting something different and interesting, and this sort of slightly nudged, almost as if someone's gone in there with a finger and just gone smear, 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 smear a little bit, is generally what you will get when you displace textures essentially by themselves. You do normally want a little bit of breakup. Now, in some instances you'll want to fiddle more with this displacing node, and sometimes you want to fiddle more with the settings for the main node. Just for starters, that's what we'll do here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring my small scale really low to give me this. If I just disconnect that for a moment, it's really patchy, cellular looking crumple. Okay, so I'm still seeing that little pattern of cells, but it is of course quite broken up. What we'll do is we'll take the displacer texture here and we'll just try upping its bump amount, because whilst we can see this is being nudged, it's not an awful lot, so let's push it up to 30%. Okay, now this is starting to give us something very different indeed. We're starting to get a really very random looking and very detailed natural pattern. Far more detailed than we were of course seeing in the crumple texture by itself. This is starting to look not procedural at all. In fact, to me, that's looking sort of like something that you'd see under an electron microscope. Let's give our actual main texture here a flip and see what we get, because that was quite dark. Let's make it into a much lighter version. And that also presents a very interesting surface. Perhaps some kind of terrain viewed from very high up. Perhaps tree bark, even. Making these little pads and nubs, little dents and scratches almost. Let's try some variation in here. Let's get a marble. Okay, so there's our basic marble procedural. Let's try displacing our crumple with this instead, and let's use the alpha value. Okay, making a big mess of it. We might want to slip a multiply in here to scale that, but even still, just looking at what we've got here, that to me isn't so far off something perhaps like cherry wood veneer. Lots of little wood ringlets all meshed in together. Let's jump to the bump again, because we can just scale that quickly and easily. Well, we can see the marble shape showing through quite clearly. And this is something that you will get when using certain procedurals, especially ones that have a recognizable pattern like the marble, which is stripy, more or less. So let's bring you on down, and there we can see what it's tending to do much better. Again, this stripiness is still exceedingly visible. Let's have a look at the other way round, shall we? What happens if we start displacing our marble instead? Let's take a look at this quite fat cellular crumple first. Well, we seem to be back to something not unbecoming of a close-up on tree bark. The runs of vertical lines with slight cracks of segmentation. Perhaps a little obvious close up, but for a medium level shot of such a surface, something like that might work quite well. We'll of course bring its amplitude down, and now it starts to look not so good. As we can see, that very stark cellular pattern comes through quite obviously and is reasonably ugly, most especially at lower levels of amplitude. But it does seem that once we get higher in this kind of combination, we're getting something that can indeed be quite useful. So predicting these outcomes of what you're going to mix with what, essentially planning your surfaces, does come down to this observation that the pattern of one does show through in the displacement of another. Sometimes when you hook things up, like at the beginning when I hook crumple straight into crumple, you just get noise because there is so much chaotic displacement. And the pattern has become so noisy that of course you're not seeing it and the whole thing is noisy anyway. But once you get into this more subtle adjustment, you can start to get a predictable outcome. So for instance here with the marble, I've picked it because I'm going to be texturing something or other that has a reasonably vertical, stripy texture to it, but unfortunately not this perfect and consistent. And so I can know that I want to break it up quite a bit, but without losing the marbliness of it. And so by using another texture that has good blocks of size, I can predict that I'm going to get these chunks shifted about. And with a little bit of play on the bump scale, and of course the actual scale of this crumple texture, and how much movement it therefore provokes over how small or large an area, then I can start to plan which procedurals I'm going to pick in order to create these more complex surfacing effects. As you go through and you try this out for yourself, what you will discover is that some just become known to have predictable outcomes, such as turbulence. If we take turbulence and we displace it directly with turbulence, you will always start to get this sort of scuffed and mottled appearance to the texture. Most noisy textures, turbulence, crumple, crackle, etc., when displaced via marble, tend to give these very liquidy, watery looking type surfaces. You can of course also animate things. In this case I've taken the marble and I've animated on the Z, so it's passing through this plane. And it's interesting, although in all honesty it's probably a bit fast. If I slow it down, obviously we're missing frames, but it looks better in terms of movement. You can see the little ripples that are coming into the turbulence texture underneath, which is making these streaks because I've got it stretched out in its Y. This marble is probably the wrong texture for it because of this stripy obviousness that you get. But aside from that, a technique like this of animating stuff, good for say a body of water that's rippling very fast because it's being rained on or similar. We can try good old flakes with, here I've got a rigid multifractal. This demonstrates one of the also very common uses of this whole process of displacing textures, is taking things that have very obvious patterns but which are just too ordered, too procedural, too CG, and breaking those up. That's also a lot more predictable, more so than taking these random noisy patterns and busting those with more random noisy patterns. And of course there's breaking up really obviously pattern stuff, like when we're trying to do say a brick wall in some kind of ArcViz. The brick procedural is accurate but terribly unrealistic. Perhaps if we had a marble that was appropriately stretched and fitted, we could give it just a little up-down wobble, not so much side to side. All we need is a make vector We'll take the alpha, so now we get an x and z0 with a y value which we can pump into position. It's clearly way too much, so we multiply it. 0.04 is a bit strong even, 2%, that works out well. Might also be nice to take a little heteroterrain perhaps, one that's been scaled really small. Plug that into our brick to give them these fuzzy little edges the way that bricks usually do have, obviously part owing to their bump. We can start adding them up, give ourselves both effects. Small little adjustments that make for quite a different outcome. So there we go, that is texture displacement for you in Nodal. How to use it, how to try and plan for it and think your way through it. And of course some of the tricks and looks that you can get.